The stale, thin air of the apartment felt heavy in Eliza's lungs, each breath a struggle against the crushing weight on her chest. Outside, the city hummed with a life that felt 1,000,000 miles away, a distant symphony of car horns and faint music that had no place in her silent world. She sat at the small, wobbly kitchen table, her gaze fixed on the only 2 items laid out before her. One was the eviction notice, its stark, red letters screaming, "Final warning," a cruel slash of ink on cheap-ass, flimsy paper. It felt brittle and sharp in her hands. The other was a single $20 bill. Worn, soft, and faded, it was the sum total of her existence, the last remnant of a life that had been systematically dismantled by hospital bills and grief. Her heart didn't just ache, it felt like a cold, hard knot in her chest, a permanent clench of fear. She ran a finger over the crisp edge of the paper notice. Next week. 7 days until the lock would be changed, until she and her son, Leo, would be standing on the unforgiving pavement with nothing but the clothes on their backs. $20. The number echoed in the suffocating silence. It wasn't a lifeline. It was an insult. A wave of nausea rose in her throat, sour and hot. It was the familiar taste of panic. Her stomach was a hollow, aching void, a constant, gnawing reminder that she had eaten only a piece of bread that day, so that Leo could have the last of the milk and cereal. Exhaustion had settled deep in her bones, a fatigue so profound it felt like a physical illness. She closed her eyes, but the images of her husband Daniel in that sterile white hospital room flooded her mind, the incessant, rhythmic beeping of the machines that had become the soundtrack to her despair, the antiseptic smell that she could never quite wash from her memory. The stacks of medical debt weren't just paper, they were a monument to their failed battle, a testament to every futile procedure and every dose of false hope they had clung to. She looked down at her hands, the hands of a seamstress. The skin was rough with calluses around the thumbs and index fingers, a map of 1,000 hours spent at a sewing machine that now sat in the corner, shrouded in a dusty sheet, silent as a tombstone. Her skill, her art was useless now. There was nothing left to mend. From the other room, she could hear the soft, steady rhythm of Leo's breathing. He was only 8, asleep under a thin blanket, blissfully unaware of the precipice they were teetering on. A surge of love, so fierce it was painful, washed over her, immediately followed by a gut-wrenching terror. This wasn't just her failure, it was his. She was failing to protect him from a world that was cold and unforgiving. The thought of a homeless shelter, the smells, the sounds, the crush of other people's despair, made her skin crawl. A shiver traced its way down her spine, cold as ice. How could she explain to him that their home was no longer theirs? How could she answer the innocent, trusting look in his eyes when he asked where they would go? The silence of her imagined non-answer was a deafening roar in her ears. She felt a tear, hot and solitary, trace a path down her cheek, leaving a cold trail in its wake. She wasn't just losing a home. She was losing her son's childhood, his safety, his belief that his mother could fix anything. The memory of Daniel's laughter echoed in the barren apartment, a cruel ghost of a happier time. She remembered him coming home from his construction job, his work boots thudding on the floor, his face tired, but always breaking into a wide smile when he saw her and Leo. He'd bring her a single, cheap flower he'd picked from a city park, its scent filling their small living space with a temporary sweetness. Now, the only scent was one of dust and slow decay, the smell of poverty. The warmth of his presence had been replaced by a chilling emptiness that the city's indifferent hum could never fill. Every corner of the apartment held a memory she could no longer afford to keep. She felt a profound, crushing loneliness, the feeling of being a single, flickering candle in a vast, dark hurricane. The world hadn't just moved on since he died. It had turned on her, revealing its sharpest teeth, and she was left to face it utterly and completely alone. The grief was no longer a sharp pain, but a dull, constant ache, a companion to the hunger and the fear. Eliza walked to the window, her bare feet cold against the worn linoleum. She pushed aside the threadbare curtain and looked down at the streetlights, which cast a sickly yellow glow on the pavement below. The cars moved like glowing insects, each one carrying people to their homes, to their dinners, to their lives. They were all strangers, living in a different universe, one where $20 wasn't the final word in a death sentence. She gripped the windowsill, her knuckles turning white. The cold from the glass seeped into her fingers. She felt invisible, as if she could fall from that window and no one would notice. Just another piece of debris in a city that never stopped. The finality of her situation settled over her, not with a crash, but with a quiet, chilling certainty. Hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. There was no one coming. There was no miracle on the horizon. A deep, hollow coldness filled her chest, extinguishing the last embers of fight she had left. They were already on the street. They just didn't know it yet. The letter arrived 3 days after the eviction notice, a stark, jarring contrast to the cheap, angry red ink of her impending doom. It was on thick, cream-colored paper, heavy and important in her trembling hands. The seal of a law firm was embossed in the corner. Her heart, which had been a cold, hard knot of fear, gave a painful lurch. It was from a lawyer in West Virginia, informing her that a distant great-uncle, a man whose name was only a whisper from her childhood, had passed away. As his last known relative, she was the sole heir to his only asset, a family homestead. The words property and heir felt like a foreign language, celestial and unreal. She reread the paragraph 3 times, the scent of official paper and dry ink filling her senses. A lifeline, thrown from the ghost of a man she never knew, had appeared in the middle of her drowning. It felt too good, too simple to be true. Her hands shook, not from weakness, but from the sudden, violent return of a feeling she thought had died. Hope. The decision was a terrifying, instantaneous gamble. That single, worn $20 bill on the table was no longer a symbol of her failure. It was the fuel for their escape. She looked at Leo, sleeping peacefully, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, unaware that their world was about to be upended. A fierce, protective resolve surged through her veins, displacing the cold dread. This was a chance, perhaps their only one. She made the call. The sewing machine, her trusted companion and the tool of her trade, was sold for a pittance, just enough for 2 one-way bus tickets and a bag of sandwiches. The man who bought it barely looked at her, his eyes only on the machine. As he carried it away, the silence it left behind was absolute, a final, hollow echo of her past life. Packing their few belongings into 2 battered bags felt like closing a book. She was betting everything they didn't have on a dead man's promise and a place she'd never seen. There was no other choice. The bus station was a cacophony of human desperation. The air was thick with the acrid smell of diesel exhaust and stale, burnt coffee. Eliza clutched Leo's hand, a small warm anchor in a sea of rushing strangers. The bus groaned and hissed, a mechanical beast ready to swallow them whole and transport them to an unknown fate. As the sprawling, indifferent city shrank in the grimy rear window, Eliza felt a strange sense of release. She was leaving behind the sight of her grief, the constant reminders of her failure. Leo, initially thrilled by the adventure, pressed his face to the glass, pointing out trucks and bridges until the monotony of the highway lulled him to sleep, his head a heavy, precious weight on her lap. Eliza stared out at the endless green blur of the countryside, her mind a frantic mix of prayer and panic. With every mile that passed, the fragile flame of hope she was nursing felt a little more real, a little more possible. She was running towards something, not just away. The journey pushed them deeper into the heart of Appalachia, and the world outside the window transformed. The flat, wide highways gave way to narrow, treacherous roads that coiled around the bases of colossal mountains. These ancient green giants, their peaks perpetually veiled in a soft, mysterious mist, seemed to watch their passage with a silent, heavy indifference. The air that leaked through the rattling window frames grew cooler, carrying the rich, loamy scent of damp earth, pine needles, and decaying leaves. The towns became smaller, more weathered, their main streets lined with faded brick buildings and storefronts that seemed frozen in time. A profound sense of isolation began to seep into Eliza's thoughts, a stark contrast to the crushing anonymity of the city. It felt like traveling backward, into a forgotten corner of the world where time moved at a different, slower pace. A new kind of unease, a quiet dread, began to prickle at the edges of her hope. This place felt wild, untamed. Their journey ended not with a town, but with a jarring halt at a lonely crossroads. A single, rusted metal sign, riddled with bullet holes, leaned crookedly, bearing the words Shadow Creek. This was it. A gas station with a small and cluttered general store attached was the only sign of civilization. The bus pulled away with a long, mournful hiss of its brakes, abandoning them to a silence so deep it felt like a pressure in their ears, punctuated only by the deafening drone of cicadas. The isolation was no longer a creeping feeling. It was a physical wall surrounding them. Inside the store, the air thick with the smell of dust and chewing tobacco, a grim-faced owner gave them curt directions. "End of the dirt road," he grunted, barely looking up. "Can't miss the old Hemlock place. It's the only thing down there." The finality in his tone sent a cold shiver down Eliza's spine. A terrible premonition began to form, a dark cloud gathering over her fragile new hope. Her stomach twisted into a tight knot. The dirt road was a cruel deception. It was little more than a pair of muddy ruts carved into the wilderness, overgrown with weeds and flanked by a dense, suffocating wall of trees. The humidity was a physical weight, pressing down on them, making every breath feel like drawing in water. The cheap fabric of Eliza's shirt was soaked with sweat, clinging uncomfortably to her skin. Their bags, which had seemed manageable at the station, now felt as though they were filled with stones. Leo, his small legs aching, began to whine, his initial excitement completely extinguished by the oppressive heat and the endless, monotonous green. The forest was alive with unseen things. The constant rustle in the undergrowth and the sudden crack of a twig made Eliza's heart jump. The hope that had propelled her this far was beginning to unravel, thread by painful thread. She felt small and exposed, a trespasser in a world that did not want her. Every step was a monumental effort against a rising tide of dread. After an hour of torturous walking, they rounded a sharp bend in the road and her world stopped. There, set back from the path, was the house, or what was left of it. The structure sagged in on itself, a broken skeleton of a home being slowly devoured by the relentless green of the forest. Disbelief struck Eliza with the force of a physical blow, making her stagger. A wave of dizziness and nausea washed over her. This could not be it. It was a mistake, a cruel cosmic joke. But then her eyes found the mailbox, rusted and tilting at an impossible angle, its door hanging open. Faintly, through the rust and grime, she could just make out the peeling letters of a name she vaguely recognized from the lawyer's letter. The truth crashed down on her, shattering the delicate vessel of hope she had so carefully carried. Shards of despair pierced her heart. Her legs felt like they might buckle, and she gripped Leo's shoulder to keep from falling to her knees right there in the muddy, unforgiving road. They pushed through the waist-high weeds, the sharp thorns catching at their clothes. The air grew thick and cloying, a sickeningly sweet perfume of rot and decay. It was the smell of a forgotten grave. Weeds as thick as her wrist coiled around what was once a porch, their tendrils creeping like skeletal fingers through the shattered window frames. A large section of the porch roof had given way entirely, its splintered timbers lying in a heap of grey, weathered wood. The buzzing of flies was a constant, maddening hum. From the dark recesses beneath the porch, she heard the frantic scuttling of rats. Her stomach churned. The bile of pure panic rose in her throat. This was not a sanctuary. This was not a roof over their heads. This was a tomb, a final resting place for a dream that had only just been born. The silence of the place felt predatory, broken only by the sound of her own ragged breathing and the thumping of her terrified heart against her ribs. This was worse than the street. The house itself was a monument to decay. The wooden siding, stripped of its paint by decades of sun and rain, was warped and stained a dark, mottled black like bruised skin. The windows were empty sockets, their glass long gone, leaving jagged teeth of broken panes clinging to the rotting sills. On the left side of the house, the roof had collapsed inward, creating a massive, gaping wound that opened the interior to the sky. Through the hole, she could see the dark, naked ribs of the rafters. It looked as if some immense, malevolent force had smashed its fist down upon the structure, breaking its back. A single, solitary shutter clung to a lone hinge, banging a hollow, rhythmic beat against the wall with each faint puff of wind. That lonely, repetitive sound was the only heartbeat in this dead place, a sound that echoed the vast emptiness that was now opening up inside of her. The front door was ajar, a dark, menacing mouth daring them to enter the rot within. She pushed the door, and it swung inward on protesting, screeching hinges, A blast of cold, stagnant air rushed out to meet them, carrying a stench so powerful it made her gag. It was the concentrated essence of decay, an overwhelming miasma of damp mold, wet earth, animal filth, and something else. Something acrid and sour she couldn't name. Her eyes strained to adjust to the oppressive gloom, which was pierced only by a few weak shafts of light from the broken windows. These beams illuminated a blizzard of dancing dust motes. The floor was buried under a thick carpet of debris, crumbled plaster, dead leaves, twigs, and the tiny, dark pellets of animal droppings. The furniture that remained was in ruins, its upholstery clawed to shreds, and its wood swollen and discolored from moisture. A massive, dark stain spread across the ceiling, the source of a steady drip, 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 that landed on the floor with a sickening plop. Her heart did not just sink, it plummeted into a cold, dark void. They stood in what must have been the living room. In one corner, a rusted, pot-bellied stove listed to one side, its chimney pipe dangling precariously. The couch was a wreck, its springs erupting from the tattered fabric like broken bones, the stuffing pulled out and scattered, likely used for nests. The wooden floorboards felt soft and spongy under her feet, and Eliza found herself testing each step, terrified the rotten wood would give way and plunge them into the damp, dark space below. A film of grey, greasy grime coated every single surface, a uniform of neglect. Leo, who had been silent until now, tightened his grip on her jeans, his small body trembling. "Mommy, it smells bad," he whispered, his voice small and full of fear. The innocence of his words sliced through her shock, a direct hit to her soul. She had failed him. She had dragged her son from a home on the edge of a cliff to a tomb at the bottom of a ravine. The guilt was a physical thing, a hand squeezing her throat. A frantic, desperate search for any small sign of livability began. She stumbled into the kitchen, and her stomach lurched. The cast-iron sink was a mural of orange rust, the faucet frozen shut. There were no light fixtures, no switches on the wall, only the capped-off pipes of old gas lamps. No electricity. She ran back to the door and looked outside, her eyes scanning the property for a wellhead. She found it, a circular stone structure nearly hidden by weeds. The wooden cover was rotted through, and peering into the darkness, she could smell the foul, stagnant water below, undrinkable. In their tiny city apartment, they had a single bare bulb that worked, a toilet that flushed, and a tap that provided cleaner running water. Here they had been cast back 100 years into a state of primitive squalor she couldn't have imagined. The full, crushing weight of the catastrophe settled on her. This wasn't a house. It was a cage, and the door had just slammed shut behind them. She felt the cold metal of the trap. Moving deeper into the house felt like exploring a shipwreck. The next room was entirely impassable. The ceiling had given way completely, burying the space in a mountain of splintered rafters, decaying shingles, and what looked like old, yellowed insulation. Years of rain had poured through the gaping hole, and the floor beneath had rotted away, revealing the damp, black earth of the crawlspace. The sight of that total, catastrophic collapse felt deeply, horribly personal. It was a perfect, brutal reflection of her own life, the last ounces of her strength. The adrenaline that had been fueled by a desperate, foolish hope evaporated all at once, leaving her feeling brittle and hollow. She had been running on the fumes of a fantasy, and the engine had just seized, stranding her in the absolute middle of nowhere. There was no going back to the city. There was no moving forward in this ruin. The feeling of being trapped was no longer a fear. It was a concrete, suffocating reality. Then Leo began to cry. It wasn't the loud, angry crying of a frustrated child, but a series of quiet, broken sobs that seemed to be torn from the very depths of his small body. He was exhausted, he was terrified, and he was hungry. He buried his face against her hip, his shoulders shaking with each desolate whimper. A tremor went through Eliza's own body, a violent shudder of despair. She sank to her knees on the filthy floor, the grit and grime pressing into her jeans, and pulled him into a fierce hug. "It's okay, baby. We're okay," she whispered, the lie feeling like poison on her tongue. The words were hollow, meaningless in the face of this overwhelming ruin. She felt his hot tears soaking through the thin fabric of her shirt, each one a fresh accusation. Looking over his head at the decay surrounding them, a despair so total that it felt like a physical illness washed over her. She had thought the eviction notice was rock bottom. She had been so naive. This was the abyss. As the sun began to set, the shadows inside the ruinous house stretched and bled into one another, transforming the wreckage into a maze of impenetrable darkness. The forest, which had been merely oppressively silent, began to come alive with a symphony of unnerving nocturnal sounds. The low, mournful hoot of a distant owl, the sharp snap of a twig just outside a broken window, the ghostly moan of the wind as it passed through the gaping hole in the roof. Eliza held Leo tight against her chest, her own fear a cold, metallic taste on her tongue. She had spent every last cent, sold the one thing that defined her, and hauled her child across the state for this. For a pile of mold and rot at the end of a road to nowhere. The despair was no longer a feeling. It was the air she was breathing. There was no fight left. There was no plan. There was nothing. Sitting on the filthy floor, she finally, completely gave up. The darkness inside her was now as deep and absolute as the night swallowing the house. Morning broke not with a gentle dawn, but with a harsh, grey light that filtered through the broken windows, painting the squalor in bleak, unforgiving detail. The chill of the night had settled deep into Eliza's bones, a cold that felt eternal, but it was the sound of Leo stirring beside her, a soft whimper in his sleep, that finally pierced the thick fog of her surrender. Seeing his small face, smudged with dirt and etched with a fear that shouldn't belong to a child, ignited a tiny, defiant ember in the cold void of her chest. It was a mother's instinct, ancient and fierce, refusing to let her child wake up in a tomb. She couldn't fix the roof or conjure water, but she could fight the chaos in one small corner. She could give him a clean patch of floor. A flicker of resolve, born not of hope but of pure, stubborn love, made her push herself up from the filthy floorboards, her muscles screaming in protest. The air was still thick with the stench of mold, but for the first time, she inhaled it not as a victim, but as a combatant. She chose the room that was least ravaged by the elements, a small space that might have been a bedroom. One window was cracked but mostly intact, and the ceiling, though stained, was still holding. The floor was a disaster zone, littered with plaster, dead leaves, and the detritus of decades. She found an old, splintered broom leaning in a corner, its bristles stiff and matted. The act of sweeping felt absurd, like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon, yet it was something to do. It was an action. The rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape of the broom on the gritty floor was a small sound of order in a symphony of decay. It was a pushback against the overwhelming filth. With each stroke, she wasn't just clearing debris, she was clearing a space in her own mind, fighting back the suffocating paralysis that had gripped her. Her arms ached, and dust filled her throat, but she focused on the small patch of wood she was uncovering, a tiny island in a sea of rot. She felt the first bead of sweat trace a clean path through the grime on her temple. Leo, awakened by the noise, watched her from the doorway, his eyes wide and uncertain. She gave him a weak, strained smile, trying to project a confidence she was a universe away from feeling. He shuffled into the room, his small feet careful to stay on the parts she had already swept. He picked up a small piece of wood and began to mimic her actions, dragging it across the floor. The sight sent a painful pang through Eliza's heart, a mix of love and profound sadness. He was trying to help. He was trying to make a home out of this wreckage. Lost in her work, focused on the methodical rhythm, she didn't see him stumble. He tripped over a raised edge of a floorboard, his small body hitting the newly cleared wood with a soft thud. But the sound that followed wasn't soft. It was a deep, hollow thump. It was entirely different from the solid, groaning sounds of the rest of the rotten house. It was the sound of a void. It stopped Eliza's sweeping instantly. Her breath caught in her throat. "You okay, sweetie?" she asked, her voice tight, her eyes locked on the floorboard Leo had tripped over. He nodded, already getting up, but she barely registered it. She knelt down, her knees pressing into the wood. She ran her fingers over the board. It was loose, just slightly. She pressed down on one end. It gave a little, and a faint but distinct creaking sound echoed from below. It wasn't the groan of stressed timber. It was the sound of a hinge. Her heart, which had been beating a slow, tired rhythm, began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic, sudden drumbeat of adrenaline. She looked around the room, her eyes darting, searching. A heavy iron fireplace poker, what a sane person would call a crowbar in this context, lay amidst the rubble near the hearth. It was rusted and heavy. She grabbed it. The cold, rough metal, a shock to her system. It felt like a weapon, or a key, a frantic, illogical hope. The very thing she had sworn off began to bubble up inside her, hot and dizzying. With the end of the poker, she wedged it into the thin crack beside the floorboard. The wood was old and thick. She put her weight into it, her muscles straining, a low grunt escaping her lips. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a loud, splintering crack and a groan of rusted metal, the board popped upward. It wasn't just a board. It was a small, cleverly disguised trapdoor. A puff of air, impossibly ancient and musty, rushed out from the dark space below, a smell of dry rot, undisturbed dust, and something else, the faint, papery scent of old leather. Eliza's hands were trembling so violently she could barely function. She tossed the poker aside and, with her bare fingers, lifted the small wooden door completely. There, nestled in a small, dust-choked compartment, sat a metal box. It was old and rusted, its surface a mottled landscape of brown and orange corrosion. A chill, completely unrelated to the cold of the house, traced its way down her spine. This was not an accident. This was hidden. Leo crawled closer, his fear forgotten, replaced by a child's pure curiosity. "What is it, Mummy?" he whispered, his voice full of awe. Eliza couldn't answer. Her throat was too tight. She reached into the dark compartment, her fingers brushing against decades of thick, velvety dust. The box was heavy, heavier than it looked. She lifted it out and placed it on the floor between them. It had no visible lock, just a simple clasp so rusted it was fused shut. She took a deep breath, the dusty air scratching her lungs, and used the end of the poker again, this time as a lever to pry the lid open. The metal screeched in protest, a long, high-pitched shriek that echoed in the silent house. Then, with a final, shuddering pop, the lid gave way. Eliza felt a wave of dizziness. She was afraid to look. What if it was nothing? What if it was just more dust, more decay? She forced herself to look down, her heart pounding in her ears. Inside, resting on a bed of what looked like rotted, yellowed fabric, were two objects. The first was a key. It was huge and ornate, made of heavy, blackened iron. It wasn't a simple house key. It was a key from a fairy tale, with a complex angle circular head and a thick suan formidable shaft. It felt cold and impossibly heavy in her hand, a key meant for a castle gate or a dungeon door. The second object made her breath catch. It was a book, a journal, bound in dark, cracked leather. It was thick and swollen with its contents, held shut by a simple leather strap. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the worn, smooth texture of the cover. It smelled ancient, a rich combination of old paper, crumbling leather, and the faint, unmistakable scent of dried ink. A sense of profound significance washed over her, a feeling that she was holding not just a book, but a life, a story. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the brittle leather strap, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and frantic anticipation. The strap crumbled to dust under her touch. She carefully opened the cover. On the first page, written in an elegant, fading cursive, were the words, "Property of Alistair Hemlock." Her blood ran cold. Alistair Hemlock. That was her grandfather's name, not her great-uncle's. The man who had died young, a story her mother had always shrouded in vague sadness and shame. Why was his journal hidden here in his brother's house? 1,000 questions exploded in her mind, a dizzying spiral of confusion and intrigue. She had inherited the property from her great-uncle, a man named Silas. This discovery made no sense. It was a piece from a different puzzle entirely. She turned the page, her fingers clumsy. The ink was faded, a pale brown against the yellowed paper, but the words were still legible. The first entry was dated October 12th, 1973. "The bastards think they can scare me off," it began. "They are mistaken. This land is mine. The gold is mine." Gold. The word leaped off the page, a jolt of electricity straight to her heart. She slammed the journal shut. Her mind was reeling, a chaotic storm of information and emotion. Gold, grandfather, hidden journal, and a key, a massive iron key. Her eyes darted around the ruin, seeing it now not just as a collapsing shell, but as a place of secrets, a place with a history far darker and more complex than simple neglect. Where would a key like this fit? Her gaze fell towards the floor, towards the direction of the back of the house, where she had seen the collapsed section of the kitchen, the cellar. She remembered seeing a heavy wooden door in the floor, nearly hidden under the debris from the caved-in ceiling. A sudden, driving urgency seized her. The hunger, the cold, the exhaustion, it all vanished, burned away by the white-hot fire of this new mystery. "Stay here, Leo," she said, her voice strained. "Don't move from this room." She grabbed the key, its weight a solid, terrifying reality in her hand, and scrambled back towards the darkest part of the house. The cellar door was swollen shut and half buried, but with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, Eliza clawed away the plaster and splintered wood until she could get a grip on the iron ring that served as a handle. She pulled with all her might, her feet sliding on the filthy floor. With a great, sucking groan, the door lifted, releasing a wave of overpowering stench. It was the foul, stagnant smell of trapped, unmoving water, a smell so thick and putrid it made her gag. Peering down into the absolute blackness, she could hear the gentle lapping of water. The basement was flooded. Of course it was. Despair, the old familiar enemy, tried to reclaim her, whispering that it was hopeless. But then she felt the hard, cold weight of the key in her pocket. She had a piece of the puzzle. She couldn't stop now. She found an old dented bucket in the kitchen debris and began the Sisyphean task of bailing. Hours passed. Bucket after bucket of black, foul-smelling water was hauled up and dumped outside, her arms and back screaming in protest. Slowly, agonizingly, the water level dropped. First, the top steps of a stone staircase emerged from the muck, then another and another. Finally, as the water receded to a knee-deep pool at the bottom, she saw it, lit by the weak beam of the flashlight she'd had in her bag. It was a gate, a heavy iron gate. Its bars, thick with rust, was set into a stone archway, blocking off a portion of the cellar, and in the center of the gate was a lock, a massive, rusted iron lock that looked as if it hadn't been touched in 100 years. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. She waded into the freezing, slimy water, the cold a brutal shock that stole her breath. Debris and mud sucked at her shoes. She reached the gate, her hands trembling as she pulled the heavy key from her pocket. The key was slick with grime. She struggled to fit it into the keyhole, pushing against 50 years of rust and corrosion. For a terrible moment, it wouldn't go. Panic seized her. Then, with a final, desperate shove, it slid home. She gripped the circular head of the key with both hands and turned. The sound was monstrous, a tortured, grinding shriek of metal on metal that echoed horribly in the stone chamber. It was the sound of a tomb being forced open. The resistance was immense, but she poured every ounce of her fear, her anger, and her desperate, burgeoning hope into that single motion. With a final, deafening clang, the lock mechanism gave way. The gate swung inward with a low, deep groan, opening a passage into even deeper darkness. The air that flowed out was different. It was still damp and earthy, but it lacked the putrid smell of the stagnant water. It was the smell of a sealed-off space, of cold stone and dry dust. She shone her flashlight beam into the opening. It was a small stone-walled chamber, no bigger than a closet. The back wall was made of the same rough-hewn stone as the rest of the cellar. It looked like a dead end. Confusion and disappointment crashed over her. Had she done all this for nothing? Her shoulders slumped. The exhaustion returned with a vengeance, a heavy cloak settling over her. She leaned against the wall of the small chamber to catch her breath, her hand flat against the cold, damp stone. And that's when she felt it. One of the bricks, no, not a brick, a stone block, at the bottom of the wall was loose. It shifted slightly under the pressure of her hand. Her breath caught. Adrenaline, sharp and electric, shot through her again. She knelt in the shallow water, her light beam focused on the spot. The mortar around this single stone was different, darker and more crumbly. She pressed it again. It definitely moved. Using her fingers, she scraped away the crumbling mortar, her nails breaking against the rough stone. She could get her fingertips behind the edge. She pulled. The stone was heavy, but it slid out of the wall with a soft, grinding sound, revealing a dark, rectangular hole. A cold draft, carrying the distinct, musty scent of old leather, whispered from the opening. Her heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She couldn't breathe. She reached into the hole, her arm disappearing into the wall up to her shoulder. Her fingers brushed against something that was not stone. It was smooth, cool, and yielded slightly to her touch. Leather. Her fingers found a handle. She pulled, and an object began to slide out of the darkness. It was incredibly heavy, far heavier than it should have been. It took all her strength to drag it out of the hole and into the dim light of the cellar. It was an old leather briefcase, the kind a doctor or a lawyer might have carried decades ago. It was thick with dust, but otherwise remarkably preserved. Her hands, slick with muddy water, fumbled with the two brass latches on the front. They were stiff but not locked. With a loud click-clack, they sprang open. She hesitated for a single, heart-stopping second, then slowly lifted the lid. The flashlight beam hit the contents, and for a moment her brain couldn't process what she was seeing. It was a dull, heavy, yellow gleam, not the bright, glittering shine of movie treasure, but a dense, weighty, buttery glow. The briefcase was filled to the brim with gold bars. They were small, about the size of a candy bar, each one stamped with a number and a symbol. They were packed tightly together, a solid block of impossible wealth. A strangled sound escaped her lips. A half sob, half laugh. It couldn't be real. This was a dream, a hallucination brought on by hunger and despair. She reached out a trembling finger and touched one of the bars. It was cold, smooth, and unbelievably heavy. It was real. The sheer, staggering reality of it stole the air from her lungs. She felt lightheaded, the dark cellar walls seeming to spin around her. She was touching more money than she had ever imagined existed in one place. Overwhelmed, she let the lid fall shut. But there was more. She reached back into the dark cavity in the wall. Her fingers found another handle. She pulled, and a second briefcase, identical to the first, emerged. She opened it. More gold, and then a third. More still. The sheer volume of it was incomprehensible. It was a fortune beyond the wildest dreams of kings, hidden in the wall of a rotting house in the middle of nowhere. Tucked beside the third briefcase was something else. A small, heavy pouch made of soft deerskin and tied with a leather thong. She picked it up. It was lumpy and made a soft clinking sound. Her fingers, numb with shock, fumbled with the knot. She loosened the thong and poured the contents into her palm. Her flashlight caught them, and the dark, miserable cellar was suddenly filled with 1,000 tiny, dazzling points of light. They were diamonds, raw, uncut diamonds, sparkling with a fiery, internal brilliance that was hypnotic. They felt like jagged pieces of ice and fire in her hand. She sat back on her heels in the filthy water, the gold and diamonds arrayed before her in the weak circle of her flashlight. The world had tilted on its axis. $20. The number echoed in her mind. A ghost from another lifetime. She had been mourning the loss of a life over $20 just yesterday. Now, she was staring at a fortune that could buy and sell that life 1,000 times over. The contrast was so vast, so violently absurd that she began to laugh. A wild, unhinged sound that bounced off the stone walls. It was the laugh of a woman who had been pushed past every conceivable limit and had come out the other side into a world that no longer made sense. She was rich. She and Leo were safe. The thought was so huge, so revolutionary, that her mind couldn't fully grasp it. The weight of her poverty, a physical burden she had carried for so long, began to lift, and the feeling was so strange and light it was terrifying. But as the initial shock began to subside, a cold thread of reason wove its way through her euphoria. This much wealth, hidden this secretly, wasn't a gift. It was a liability. It was a story, with a dark beginning. Her eyes fell on the leather-bound journal she had left upstairs, which now felt infinitely more important than the gold or the diamonds. That was the key, not the iron one in her pocket, but the one written in faded ink on yellowed paper, her grandfather's words. "The bastards think they can scare me off. The gold is mine." A deep, chilling premonition settled over her. This fortune wasn't a solution. It was the beginning of a new, far more dangerous problem. The mystery of who her grandfather was and why he had hidden this treasure was no longer a historical curiosity. It was a threat, and she and Leo were now standing right in the middle of it. The cold of the cellar water seemed to seep into her bones. a stark reminder of the danger that still surrounded them. She carefully pushed the heavy stone block back into place, the sound of it scraping into the wall a final, definitive act. The secret was sealed once more. She gathered one of the briefcases, just one, and the small pouch of diamonds. The weight was immense, a struggle to carry as she waded back through the murky water. The rest she would leave for now. It was safer in the wall. As she climbed the stone steps out of the cellar, she felt as though she were emerging from a grave into a different world. The house was still a ruin. The air still smelled of decay, but everything had changed. The oppressive despair was gone, replaced by a sharp to cold fear and a burning electric curiosity. She was no longer a victim of circumstance. She was the keeper of a secret, the inheritor of a fortune, and the target of a history she did not yet understand. Her heart hammered with a new kind of terror, one that was mixed with an undeniable, thrilling sense of power. Back in the semi-clean room, Leo was asleep, curled up on a pile of their clothes. He looked so small, so vulnerable. A wave of fierce protectiveness washed over Eliza. This gold wasn't just money, it was his future. It was a new life, a good life, free from the hunger and fear that had defined their existence. But it was also a danger that could destroy them both. She sat on the floor beside him, the cold, heavy briefcase on one side and the worn leather journal on the other. The immediate, desperate problem of survival had been solved, but in its place, a far more complex and shadowy puzzle had appeared. The house was no longer just a ruin. It was a treasure chest and a crime scene. The silence of the Appalachian night pressed in, no longer just empty, but filled with unanswered questions and the ghosts of her grandfather's words. She had to know the truth. She reached for the journal, her hands steady now. The gold could wait. The story couldn't. She opened the journal to the first page again, her flashlight beam her only companion in the vast darkness. The elegant script seemed to glow in the focused light. Property of Alistair Hemlock. The name felt different now, imbued with a new weight, a new danger. She thought of the shame that had always clung to his memory in her family's stories, the vague whispers of a man who had run from something, who had died in disgrace. But the man who wrote the words on this page didn't sound like a coward. He sounded angry. He sounded defiant. A deep, instinctual feeling told her that the story she had been told was a lie, a carefully constructed lie designed to hide what she had just found in the cellar. The journal felt warm in her hands, a living thing, a direct connection to a man she'd never known but whose legacy had just fallen, with the weight of gold bars, directly into her lap. The house around her groaned, the wind picking up outside, rattling the lone, broken shutter in a rhythmic, mournful beat. The sound seemed to be speaking to her, whispering warnings from the past. Every shadow seemed to deepen. Every rustle of leaves outside felt like a footstep. The isolation that had felt like a tomb now felt like a temporary shield. But she knew it wouldn't last. A fortune this large didn't stay lost forever. Someone, somewhere knew about it, or at least they knew the legend of it. Her grandfather's words echoed again. The bastards think they can scare me off. Who were they? Were they still out there? Were their children? A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. The mystery was no longer about the past. It was about the present. It was about her and Leo alone in this house, sitting on a secret that could get them killed. The weight of that realization was heavier than any of the gold. She traced the name on the page, Alistair Hemlock. Her grandfather, a prospector, a fighter, a man who had found a king's ransom and had been forced to hide it. Who was he really? What had happened in this house, on this land? The questions were a dizzying torrent, each one leading to another, deeper and darker. She looked from the journal to the sleeping form of her son, then to the heavy briefcase sitting in the shadows. She had stumbled out of one nightmare and straight into another, but this one was different. In this nightmare she had a weapon. She had the truth, or at least the beginning of it, resting in her hands, a fierce determination, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, solidified within her. She would not run. She would not be scared off. She would read every single word in this journal. She would uncover the story, no matter how dark it was, for her grandfather, for herself, and most of all, for Leo. Her fingers trembled as she turned to the first entry. The flashlight beam was a small, brave circle of light in the overwhelming darkness, and within that circle, a 50-year-old story was about to begin. The The smell of dust, mold, and damp earth filled her senses, but now it was mixed with the scent of old ink and the faint, metallic tang of the fortune hidden beneath her feet. The house was no longer a symbol of her failure. It had become a battleground. The first act of her desperate struggle was over, but the main event, the fight for the truth and the treasure, had just begun. She took a deep breath, held it, and began to read. The leather of the journal was cool and brittle under her fingertips, a stark contrast to the oppressive humidity of the room. With Leo sleeping soundly, a small, fragile island of peace in the wreckage, Eliza began to read. The pages whispered as she turned them, a dry, rustling sound that spoke of decades of silence. The flashlight beam moved slowly across the elegant, looping script. Her grandfather's words, initially filled with a prospector's hope, painted a vivid picture of this land as it once was. He wrote of the scent of pine after rain, the back-breaking joy of digging, the thrill of finding tiny flecks of color in his pan. Then the entries darkened. He wrote of being watched, of a cold presence in the woods. "Sheriff Thompson has taken an unhealthy interest in my claim," one entry read. Eliza felt a cold knot form in her stomach. The name felt like a rock dropped into a still pond. The sheriff. Not a protector, but a predator. The words made her skin crawl, and she instinctively pulled her thin blanket tighter around her shoulders, the dusty wool scratching her neck. The silence of the house was no longer empty. It felt heavy with watching eyes. She read on, her own breathing becoming shallow, her heart a slow, heavy drum in her ears. The journal transformed from a log of discovery into a frantic chronicle of fear. Alistair described Sheriff Thompson as a man with a chilling smile and eyes that held no light, a powerful figure who ruled the county like a private kingdom, his authority absolute and unquestioned. He owned half the businesses and held the debts of the other half. The journal detailed Thompson's visits, his casual questions that were really veiled demands, his offers to protect the land for a share of whatever came out of it. "He is a snake with a badge," Alistair wrote. The script here angrier, more jagged. "He smells the gold and he will not be denied." A wave of nausea rose in Eliza's throat. She was not just reading a story, she was reading a death warrant. She could feel her grandfather's rising panic, the sense of a net tightening around him, 50 years in the past. The musty smell of the old paper seemed to grow stronger, carrying the scent of old fear and impending doom. Their tangible presence in the darkness. The most terrifying entry was dated July 12th, 1975. The ink was smudged, the handwriting frantic, almost illegible. Alistair described a family, union organizers from the coal mines, who had been passing through. They were wanted by the mining company's enforcers, and Sheriff Thompson had cornered them on Alistair's property. He shot them in cold blood, the journal screamed from the page. A man, his wife, their boy, not much older than my own Silas. Thompson said they were trespassers, agitators. He smiled as he did it. Eliza gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a cry. The horror of the words was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She felt a violent shiver rack her body. This wasn't about land grabbing, this was about a massacre. She could almost hear the gunshots echoing through the decades, see the scene playing out in this very forest. The weight of the gold in the cellar suddenly felt different. It was no longer a treasure. It was stained with blood, inextricably linked to an atrocity. The house felt like a grave. The final pages were a desperate plan. Thompson, to cover his crime and seize the land, had framed Alistair for the murders. "He put the gun in my hand," Alistair wrote, "told me to run, or my own family would be next. He would tell the world I killed the organizers in a dispute and then fled. My name would be mud, but my family would live." Eliza's vision blurred with tears. Tears of rage and a profound, aching sorrow for the grandfather she never knew. He hadn't abandoned his family in disgrace. He had sacrificed his name, his entire life, to save them. He had hidden the gold and the journal, a time bomb of truth, intending to get his family to safety and then expose Thompson from afar. But the last entry was short, weak. "The fever is bad. I cannot make it out of the hills." He had died in hiding, his story buried with him. The journal was his ghost, his final, desperate cry for justice. The silence that followed her reading was deafening, filled with the weight of this 50-year-old crime, a secret she now carried alone. A sudden, unnatural sound from outside, shattered the heavy silence. It was the low crunch of tires on the dirt road, a sound alien to this forgotten place. It was followed by the clinical, quiet purr of a well-tuned engine, a sound of money and power. Eliza's blood ran cold. Her heart leaped into her throat, beating a wild, panicked tattoo against her ribs. No one came down this road. The grim-faced store owner had made that clear. She scrambled to her feet, her body screaming with a fresh jolt of adrenaline, and extinguished her flashlight, plunging the room into absolute darkness. She crept to the broken window, her bare feet silent on the gritty floor. Her hands trembled as she peered through a jagged shard of remaining glass. A car, a long black sedan from a bygone era, but polished to a mirror shine, had pulled up where the weeds met the road. It looked like a hearse. A cold dread, sharp and specific, seized her. This was not a lost traveler. This was not a coincidence. They knew. Someone knew she was here. The car door opened with a heavy, solid thud. A man emerged, his silhouette tall and straight against the grey afternoon light. He was old, perhaps in his 70s, but he moved with a stiff, unnerving deliberateness. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit that seemed absurdly out of place in the wilderness. Even from a distance, Eliza could see the glint of perfectly polished shoes as he stepped carefully around the mud puddles. He walked toward the house, not with curiosity, but with an air of ownership, his gaze sweeping over the ruin with a look of cold assessment. He stopped at the edge of the overgrown yard, his hands clasped behind his back, a portrait of patient, predatory power. Eliza felt her stomach clench into a tight, painful knot. This man radiated an aura of danger that was far more terrifying than the house's decay. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her grandfather's past had just walked up to her door. She was no longer just a keeper of the secret. She was its guardian, and the dragon had come to claim it. He navigated the overgrown path to the porch with slow, deliberate steps, his expensive shoes making soft, sinking sounds in the damp earth. He didn't knock. He simply stood on the sagging porch, his presence a palpable weight, and called out in a voice that was smooth as honey, but carried an undeniable edge of command. "Hello, Mrs. Collins? Eliza Collins?" Hearing her name from this stranger's lips felt like a violation. A shiver traced its way down her spine. Hiding was pointless. He had a car and she was on foot with a child. There was no escape. Taking a deep, ragged breath that did nothing to calm the frantic beating of her heart, she forced her legs to move. She shoved the journal under the pile of clothes where Leo slept and walked toward the doorway, trying to compose her face into a mask of weary neutrality. Stepping out onto the porch, the rotting wood groaning under her weight, she faced the man. Up close, his face was a network of fine wrinkles, his skin pale and almost translucent, but his eyes were a startlingly bright blue, sharp and intelligent, and utterly devoid of warmth. "I am Eliza Collins," she said, her voice sounding surprisingly steady, though her insides were churning with a nauseous fear. The man gave a thin, practiced smile that did not reach his cold eyes. He extended a hand, his skin dry and papery. "Judge Miller," he announced, his tone implying the name should mean something to her. "My apologies for intruding. I am the closest thing this area has to a welcoming committee." The lie was so blatant, it was almost insulting. He smelled of expensive cologne and something else. Mothballs. The scent of things carefully preserved. The name Miller snagged in her mind, but she couldn't place it yet. "I was sorry to hear of Silas's passing," he continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "He was a fixture. I handle many of the estate affairs in this county. In fact, I've been trying to acquire this little plot for years, to add to my own holdings." He gestured vaguely at the surrounding forest, a king surveying his domain. Her stomach twisted. He wanted the land. The very land her grandfather had died for. Eliza's mind raced, connecting the dots with a terrifying speed. The journal, Sheriff Thompson, the powerful local figure, and now Judge Miller, an influential man who wanted this specific, worthless piece of land. A cold realization washed over her. So sudden and certain it made her dizzy. Thompson's son. He had to be. He had inherited his father's power, his land, and his secrets. He didn't just want the land. He was still hunting for what his father had failed to get. He was looking for the gold. He knew the legend. The Welcoming Committee Act was a sham, a test. He was here to gauge her, to see if the ignorant city girl who had inherited the ruin knew anything about its true value. A new kind of resolve, cold and hard as steel, began to form beneath her fear. She was not the desperate, helpless woman who had arrived here 2 days ago. She was Alistair Hemlock's granddaughter, and she was standing on his legacy. She would not let this man, this ghost of a past crime, take it from her. The air between them grew thick with unspoken history. "I imagine this place was quite a shock," Judge Miller said, his eyes scanning the collapsed roof with a look of theatrical pity. "Hardly a suitable home. No water, no power. Frankly, it's a liability, a danger to you and your boy." His gaze flickered towards the doorway, and a protective fury, fierce and hot, surged through Eliza. "I'm offering to take it off your hands, for your trouble. Say $500, cash, more than fair for a pile of rotten wood. Wouldn't you agree?" $500. The number was a slap in the face. It was an insult designed to underscore her desperation, to make her feel worthless, to make her believe this place was worthless. The offer was so low it confirmed everything. He wasn't trying to make a fair deal. He was trying to steal it. He was probing, testing her knowledge. If she accepted, it meant she was ignorant. If she refused, her heart hammered against her ribs. The journal's words, her grandfather's defiance, echoed in her mind. She met his cold blue eyes, her own gaze unflinching. "No," she said, the single word hanging in the air, sharp and definitive. "It's not for sale." A flicker of something, annoyance, surprise, crossed the judge's face before being instantly masked by his thin smile. The temperature on the porch seemed to drop by 10 degrees. His polite facade was a thin veneer, and she had just cracked it. "A sentimental woman," he mused, his voice losing its honeyed edge, becoming flat and cold. "I can appreciate that, but sentiment doesn't fix a roof or feed a child." The mention of Leo was a clear, calculated threat, and it sent a jolt of pure ice through her veins. He took a small step closer, invading her space. The smell of his cologne was suddenly cloying, suffocating. "This is a hard place, Mrs. Collins. A lonely place. Some of the old-timers, they say this house has ghosts." He let the word hang in the air, weighted with meaning. He wasn't talking about spirits. He was talking about the murdered family. He was telling her that he knew the story, the real story, the story that his own father had authored in blood. He was showing her a piece of his power, a glimpse of the dark history he controlled. "It's not the ghosts you have to worry about, though," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a conspiratorial and deeply menacing sound. "It's the house itself. It's falling down. Accidents happen in abandoned places like this." His blue eyes locked onto hers, and in their depths, she saw the same chilling emptiness her grandfather had described in Sheriff Thompson. The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare. An accident, a fire, a structural collapse. Things that happen, things that could be arranged. He was telling her exactly what would happen if she stayed, if she stood in his way. Her blood turned to ice water in her veins. The fear was no longer a vague dread. It was a sharp, immediate certainty of mortal danger. She was staring into the face of the man who would kill her and her son for the secret hidden beneath their feet, and he would do it with a smile, cloaked in the authority his father had passed down to him. The powerful have ways of making problems disappear. He held her gaze for a long moment, letting the threat sink in, letting the terror take root. He was confident. He saw her as a weak, frightened woman with a child trapped in a ruin. He believed he had already won. Then, with another thin, reptilian smile, he turned without another word. He walked back down the path, his posture ramrod straight, a man utterly convinced of his own power. Eliza stood frozen on the porch, her body rigid with a fear so profound it was paralyzing. She listened to his car door shut, the sound echoing the finality of a closing cell. The engine started, and the black sedan disappeared back into the suffocating green of the forest, leaving behind only the scent of exhaust and a silence that was now pregnant with violence. The air felt colder, sharper. She could feel the damp rot of the porch boards beneath her bare feet, a chilling reminder of the accident he had so casually promised. Her mind was screaming. He knew he was coming back. She stumbled back inside the house, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. She collapsed onto the filthy floor, wrapping her arms around herself, trying to stop the violent tremors that racked her body. The journal lay on the floor, its secrets now a terrifying living entity in the room with her. The gold in the cellar was no longer a symbol of hope. It was a motive for her murder. Judge Miller was not a man who made idle threats. He was the son of a killer, the inheritor of a criminal empire built on this very land. He had waited decades for this property to fall into his hands, and she was the only thing standing in his way. A wave of utter, helpless panic washed over her. She was alone, isolated, with a small child, and a powerful, ruthless man now knew she was here and that she had refused to run. The forest that surrounded them was no longer a wilderness. It was a cage, and the hunter was circling. Her gaze fell on Leo, still sleeping, his face a picture of innocence in the encroaching gloom. A sob, thick and painful, tore from her throat. Her grandfather had sacrificed everything to protect his family from this exact man's father. Now, 50 years later, she was facing the same monster in a new guise, and her own child's life was on the line. The weight of the choice before her was crushing, a physical pressure on her chest that made it hard to breathe. The briefcase full of gold sat in the corner, a silent testament to the wealth that could save them or condemn them. The judge's final words, "Accidents happen," echoed in her mind, a death sentence waiting to be carried out. She was trapped between a bloody past and a terrifying future. What would you do in her place? Would you grab what you could of the fortune and run, disappearing into the night to save your child, leaving the ghosts and their story buried forever? Or would you stay and fight for justice, knowing the powerful man who just left your porch will stop at nothing to silence you? Terror was a living thing, a cold parasite that had latched onto her spine. It pulsed with every beat of her heart, sending icy needles of fear through her veins. Judge Miller's final words, "Accidents happen," played on a ceaseless loop in her mind, not as a memory, but as a prophecy. The rotting wood of the porch beneath her feet suddenly felt malevolent, the sagging roof a waiting guillotine, the entire structure a purpose-built tomb. Every creak and groan of the house was no longer the sound of decay, but the sound of a trap being set. The heavy silence left in the wake of the judge's departure was more menacing than any noise, thick with the certainty of violence. She stumbled back inside, her body shaking uncontrollably, a profound, animal terror overriding all thought. The walls of the ruin, which had moments before represented a desperate hope, now seemed to be closing in, squeezing the very air from her lungs. She was a fly caught in a spider's web, and she had just watched the spider walk away, knowing it would be back to finish the job. The initial shock gave way to a frantic, clawing panic. Her mind, a whirlwind of fear, snagged on a single, vital thought. Leo. He was still asleep, a small, trusting lump under the pile of clothes, oblivious to the death sentence that had just been pronounced upon them. A sob, hot and ragged, tore from her throat. She had to get him out. But where? The dirt road was a single artery leading into the judge's kingdom. To run back the way they came would be to run directly into his arms. The forest on either side was a dense, impenetrable wall, a wilderness she couldn't possibly navigate, especially not at night with a child. The feeling of being trapped was absolute, a physical pressure crushing her chest. The gold in the cellar was a useless, heavy burden, an anchor that would drown them. She looked at the journal, its leather cover seeming to absorb the gloom of the room. It was proof. It was the truth. But what good was truth against a man who could orchestrate an accident with a phone call? The hopelessness was a physical nausea, sour and burning. A memory surfaced through the fog of her terror, a small, insignificant detail from the day before. The grim-faced store owner at the crossroads, his curt directions. "End of the dirt road," he had grunted. "Can't miss the old Hemlock place. It's the only thing down there." The words replayed in her mind, but now she heard a nuance she'd missed. The only thing down there. It implied there were other things, other people, not on this road, but nearby. Neighbors. Were there neighbors? The judge had called himself the welcoming committee, but also the closest thing. That meant there could be others, further away, hidden in the folds of these ancient mountains. A tiny, desperate spark flickered in the abyss of her fear. It was a wild gamble, a shot in the absolute dark. Trusting a stranger out here could be just as dangerous as facing the judge, but staying here, waiting for the accident to happen, was not an option. It was certain death, The instinct to flee, to do something, overrode the paralysis. The decision solidified into a plan, fragile and born of pure desperation. She had to find someone, anyone. The store owner had mentioned the Hemlock Place, using the family name as if it were still relevant. That meant someone in this area might remember them, might feel some lingering loyalty to the name that Judge Miller was trying to erase. She looked down at the journal in her hands. This was her only currency, her only plea for help. The story it contained was a testament to the evil that had ruled this valley, an evil that some older resident might recognize and resent. She had to try. She gently shook Leo awake. His eyes were bleary with sleep. "Mommy, I'm hungry," he murmured, his small voice cutting through her fear with a sharp pang of guilt. "I know, baby. We're going to go for a little walk. We're going to visit a friend." The lie felt heavy on her tongue, but the alternative, the terrifying truth, was unspeakable. She helped him into his shoes, her hands shaking so badly she could barely tie the laces. She grabbed the journal, wrapping it in a spare shirt and stuffing it deep into the battered bag she'd carried from the city. She also took the small, heavy deerskin pouch of diamonds, a desperate form of currency if she needed to buy their way out. The gold was too heavy, an impossible burden. She would have to leave it, praying she would one day be able to return. Leaving the house felt like a second escape. This time, she wasn't fleeing poverty. She was fleeing a murderer. She held Leo's hand in a grip so tight it was almost painful, his small fingers a fragile anchor to her sanity. Instead of taking the road, she plunged into the woods, in the opposite direction of the crossroads. The undergrowth was thick, tearing at her clothes. The ground was uneven, a treacherous landscape of tangled roots and slick, moss-covered rocks. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, menacing shadows that writhed and danced like grasping fingers. Every snap of a twig sounded like a footstep behind them. The forest grew darker, the air cooler. The rich, loamy scent of damp earth and decaying leaves was thick in her throat, a smell she now associated with fear. Leo stumbled, his small legs struggling to keep up. He began to cry, not from petulance, but from genuine exhaustion and fear. "I can't walk anymore, Mummy." Eliza's heart broke. She knelt down, her own body screaming with fatigue and terror. "It's okay, sweetie. Just a little further." She hoisted him onto her back, his small arms wrapping tightly around her neck, his tear-streaked face pressed against her shoulder. His weight was a grueling burden, but his warmth and the feel of his steady breathing were a comfort, a reason to keep moving. She pushed onward, her legs burning, her lungs on fire, guided by nothing but a frantic, desperate hope that this path would lead somewhere other than deeper into the wilderness. The world had shrunk to this single, torturous task. One more step, and another. After what felt like an eternity, a new scent cut through the smell of the forest. It was faint at first, then stronger. Wood smoke. A sign of life, a sign of civilization. Hope, sharp and painful, surged through her. She pushed through a final, thick curtain of ferns and staggered into a clearing. There, nestled in a small hollow, was a cabin. It was small and weathered, built of dark, sturdy logs, but it was the antithesis of her ruin. It was whole. A thin plume of grey smoke curled from its stone chimney, a warm, welcoming beacon against the darkening sky. A soft, yellow light glowed in a single window, a tiny star of safety in the vast, encroaching darkness. A neatly stacked pile of firewood stood against one wall, and a small, well-tended garden was visible nearby. It was a picture of order, of life, of peace. The sight was so overwhelmingly beautiful, so starkly contrasted with the decay she had left behind, that tears welled in Eliza's eyes. She had found it. She had found someone. She slid Leo gently off her back, his legs unsteady. "We're here," she whispered, her voice cracking with relief and exhaustion. She took his hand and walked slowly towards the cabin, her heart pounding a new rhythm, a frantic beat of nervous anticipation. What if this was a mistake? What if the person inside was a friend of the judge's? The fear was still there, a cold undercurrent beneath the wave of relief. She hesitated at the foot of the 3 simple wooden steps leading to the porch. The air was cool on her sweat-damp skin. She could hear the gentle crackle of a fire from inside, a sound of warmth and comfort she hadn't heard in what felt like a lifetime. She could turn back, take her chances in the woods, But she knew that was a fantasy. Her other option was the accident waiting for her in the dark, ruined house. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she raised a trembling hand and knocked on the solid wood of the door. The sound was loud and decisive in the quiet evening. The door opened with a soft creak. An old man stood silhouetted in the warm light from within. He was ancient, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his back stooped with age. He held a lit pipe in one gnarled hand, and the sweet, aromatic scent of cherry tobacco wafted out into the cool night air. He squinted at her. His eyes, nestled in deep pockets of skin, were surprisingly sharp and clear. They flickered from her disheveled appearance to the small, terrified child hiding behind her legs. Eliza's throat went dry. She had rehearsed 100 things to say, but now, faced with this stranger, the words wouldn't come. She could only stand there, trembling, clutching her son's hand, the weight of her terror and her secret rendering her mute. The old man took a slow puff from his pipe, his gaze unwavering, not with suspicion, but with a deep, patient curiosity. The silence stretched, filled only by the chirping of crickets and the frantic pounding of Eliza's heart. "You're Alistair's blood," the old man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "It wasn't a question. I can see him in your eyes. And the boys." The words hit Eliza with the force of a physical blow. He knew. He recognized a family resemblance from a man who had died 50 years ago. The relief was so sudden, so absolute, it almost brought her to her knees. This was him. This had to be the person she was looking for. Tears she had been holding back finally spilled over, silent tracks of dirt and relief on her grimy cheeks. "My name is Eliza," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "This is my son, Leo. We're in trouble. Terrible trouble." The old man's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, a deep, ancient sadness, passed through his bright eyes. He stepped back, opening the door wider. "Well, don't just stand there on the stoop, girl. Get in out of the dark. The night has teeth in these woods." He gestured them inside with his pipe stem, into the warmth and the light. The inside of the cabin was a single room, warm and cluttered, smelling of wood smoke, old books, and pipe tobacco. A fire crackled merrily in a large stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls, which were lined with overflowing bookshelves. A simple wooden table, a worn armchair, and a narrow bed were the only furniture. It was the home of a man who lived with his memories. The old man introduced himself as Abernathy, just Abernathy, as he ladled 2 bowls of thick, fragrant stew from a pot simmering by the fire. He handed one to Eliza and a smaller one to Leo, who, despite his fear, began to eat with a ravenous hunger that twisted Eliza's heart. Abernathy sat in his armchair, watching them, his silence an invitation. As she ate the first real food she'd had in days, the warmth spreading through her chilled body, Eliza's story began to pour out. The words came in a frantic, desperate torrent: the inheritance, the ruin, the discovery in the cellar, and finally, Judge Miller's visit. When she spoke the judge's name, Abernathy's face, which had been placid and kind, hardened. The light in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a cold, flinty anger. "Thompson's boy," he muttered, the name a curse on his lips. "He's got his father's ambition and none of his cunning, just the cruelty." He listened without interruption as Eliza described the journal, her voice cracking as she recounted the story of the framed union organizers and her grandfather's sacrifice. She finally pulled the wrapped journal from her bag and laid it on the table between them, the worn leather a tangible piece of evidence in the flickering firelight. Abernathy didn't need to read it. He reached out a gnarled, trembling hand and rested it on the cover, his eyes closed. "I knew it," he whispered, his voice thick with a 50-year-old sorrow. "I knew Alistair wasn't a killer. He was the best of us, and that bastard Thompson destroyed him." He looked at Eliza, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "He destroyed this whole valley." Abernathy then began to speak, his voice a low, steady murmur. And the secret history of Shadow Creek unfolded in the small, warm cabin. He spoke of Sheriff Thompson's reign of terror, a time when fear was a constant companion, when the law was nothing more than the sheriff's whim. He described how Thompson had bled the town dry, taking land, businesses, and lives with impunity. The union organizers, he explained, were a threat not just to the coal companies, but to Thompson himself. They were bringing in federal attention, shining a light into the dark corners of the county, and Thompson couldn't allow that. He had used Alistair's land as the perfect, isolated stage for his bloody work, a place where gunshots would be mistaken for a hunter's rifle, a place where bodies could disappear. Eliza listened, horrified, as Abernathy gave names and faces to the ghosts her grandfather had written about, confirming every detail, every fear. The evil wasn't a historical footnote. It was a living, breathing entity that had choked this community for generations. "Your grandfather was right to run," Abernathy said, his gaze distant, lost in memory. Thompson would have killed him without a second thought and called it justice. He fell silent for a long moment, staring into the crackling flames, the weight of the decades pressing down on him. Eliza felt a chill despite the warmth of the fire. The story was almost complete, the monstrous puzzle nearly assembled, but there was still a missing piece: the bodies. The journal proved the crime, but without the victims, it was just one dead man's word against the most powerful family in the county. As if reading her thoughts, Abernathy turned to her, his expression grim. "Miller is looking for that journal because his father never found it. Thompson knew Alistair had documented the whole thing. It was the one loose end he could never tie up. And now his boy is trying to finish the job." He leaned forward, the firelight catching the sharp angles of his ancient face, but Alistair wasn't the only witness that day. A profound stillness settled over the cabin. The only sound was the pop and hiss of the fire. Abernathy whispered, his voice barely audible. "I was just a boy, not much older than your Leo. My family's farm bordered the Hemlock property. I was out checking traps where I wasn't supposed to be. I heard the shouting, then the shots." His voice trembled, the memory still raw after half a century. "I hid in a hollow log. I watched the whole thing. I saw Thompson. I saw what he did." He squeezed his eyes shut, the scene replaying in his mind. Eliza held her breath, her heart pounding against her ribs. This was it, the final, horrifying piece. Abernathy opened his eyes, and they were filled with a terrible, clear certainty. "And I saw where he put them," he said, his voice cold as the grave. "He dragged them to the North Ridge, to the old lightning-struck oak. He buried them there, in a shallow grave. That piece of land, Miller bought it a decade ago. He owns the ground his father used as a cemetery." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with a sickening finality. It was a perfect, diabolical loop of history and crime. The proof of the murders was buried on the murderer's son's land, and the proof of the cover-up was in the journal on the table. She had it all. The whole ugly, bloody story. A wave of dizziness washed over her. This was too big, too dangerous. It wasn't just about her and Leo anymore. This was about bringing down a dynasty of corruption, of exposing a 50-year-old massacre. But as the weight of this new knowledge settled on her, a new, more immediate terror shot through her, cold and sharp. "Leo," she breathed, the name a panicked gasp. She had been so consumed by the story, so relieved to find an ally, that she had forgotten the most important thing. She had left her son sleeping in that house, that death trap, alone. A house that Judge Miller and his men could return to at any moment. The stew she had just eaten turned to acid in her stomach. "He's there," she choked out, scrambling to her feet, her chair scraping loudly on the wooden floor. "He's at the house. I have to go back. I have to get him." Abernathy was on his feet in an instant, his old eyes wide with alarm. "No, girl, wait. It's not safe." But his words were lost to her. A primal, maternal panic had taken over, drowning out all reason. The image of Leo, small and vulnerable in that dark, rotting house, flashed in her mind. What if they had already gone back? What if they thought she was still there? She snatched the journal from the table, her mind a screaming siren of pure terror. "I have to get him," she repeated, her voice a frantic whisper. She was already at the door, fumbling with the simple wooden latch, her hands clumsy with adrenaline. At that exact moment, a low, deep rumble shook the cabin. Thunder, distant, but growing closer. The storm was coming. It was a sound of profound menace, an overture to the violence she knew was imminent. Ignoring Abernathy's frantic calls to wait, to think, Eliza burst out of the cabin and into the night. The first heavy drops of rain, cold and fat, began to fall, splattering against her face and the dusty ground. The wind was picking up, moaning through the high branches of the pines, a sound like a chorus of ghosts. She ran, her feet pounding on the soft earth of the clearing, and plunged back into the blackness of the woods. The forest, which had been menacing on her way here, was now a place of pure, nightmarish terror. The path she had forged was gone, swallowed by the darkness. She ran blindly, fueled by a mother's frantic terror, branches whipping at her face, thorns tearing at her arms. A flash of lightning bleached the world white for a split second, illuminating a terrifying skeletal maze of trees, followed by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to split the sky directly overhead. The rain came down in a sudden, violent deluge, soaking her to the bone in seconds. She could hear her own ragged gasps for air, the wild thumping of her heart, the squelch of her shoes in the mud. She stumbled and fell, her hands sinking into the cold, slick mud. Pain shot through her knee, but she barely registered it. She scrambled back to her feet, her mind fixated on a single image: Leo, alone. She had to get to him. The woods seemed to fight her, to hold her back. A root caught her ankle, sending her sprawling again. She sobbed in frustration and fear, pushing herself up, mud clinging to her hair and face. Another flash of lightning, closer this time, revealed the silhouette of the ruined house through the trees. It was a dark, jagged shape against the storm-tossed sky, and there, parked where the judge's sedan had been, was a different vehicle, a battered, mud-splattered pickup truck, its shape ugly and predatory in the strobe-like flashes of light. Her blood ran cold. They were here. She was too late. She dropped to a crouch behind a thicket of rhododendrons, her body trembling so violently she had to bite her lip to keep her teeth from chattering. The rain hammered down, a solid, roaring curtain of water that blurred the scene before her. Through the deluge she could see them, two large hulking figures on the porch of the ruin. They weren't knocking. One of them threw his shoulder against the old wooden door. The sound was a dull, heavy thud. He did it again. On the third impact, there was a loud, sickening crack of splintering wood, and the door flew inward, banging against the interior wall. The two men disappeared into the black maw of the house. Eliza's heart stopped. They were inside. They were inside with her son. A wave of nausea so strong it made her retch swept over her. She was trapped, watching a nightmare unfold, utterly powerless to stop it. She could hear their voices, low and guttural, muffled by the roar of the storm. They were looking for something. They were looking for her. Her paralysis broke. The terror was still there, a shrieking thing in the back of her mind, but it was overshadowed by a cold, fierce, maternal rage. They would not touch him. She began to creep around the edge of the property, using the trees and the driving rain as cover, her movements silent and desperate. Her destination was the back of the house, the window of the small, semi-intact room where she had left Leo sleeping. It was their only chance. The house was a labyrinth of noise, the howling wind, the drumming rain, and now the heavy, thudding footsteps of the men inside, moving from room to room, the sound of things being overturned and thrown. She reached the back wall, pressing herself flat against the cold, wet wood. The window was just above her. She could hear them getting closer, their voices clearer now. "She ain't here. Where are the goddamn papers Miller was so sure about?" one of them growled. Papers, the journal. She peered cautiously over the windowsill. The room was illuminated in brief, terrifying flashes of lightning. In one flash, she saw him. Leo was awake, sitting up, his small body frozen in terror, his eyes wide in the darkness, staring at the doorway as the footsteps grew louder. In the next flash, she saw the men's shadows, long and distorted, fall across the hallway floor. There was no time, not a second. She tapped frantically on the cracked window pane. Leo's head whipped around. He saw her, his face crumpled, about to cry out. She pressed a finger to her lips in a desperate, silent plea. Understanding dawned in his terrified eyes. She fumbled with the old rusted latch. It was frozen shut. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She looked around, her eyes scanning the ground. Her hand closed around a rock, heavy and slick with rain. She didn't hesitate. She slammed it against the glass. The pane shattered with a noise that was mercifully lost in a deafening clap of thunder. She reached through the jagged hole, ignoring the sting of the glass slicing her arm, and unlocked the window from the inside. "Leo, come on, quick," she hissed. She pushed the window open. The men were in the next room now, the sound of them tearing apart furniture, a violent counterpoint to the storm. Leo scrambled to the window, his small body shaking. "Mommy," he sobbed. "I know, baby, I know. You have to climb out, right now." She pulled him through the opening, his small, trembling body clumsy with fear. He was out. He was safe. Just as his feet touched the muddy ground, she heard a shout from inside. "Hey, in here!" They had heard the glass. She grabbed Leo's hand and pulled him into the darkness of the trees. Behind them, a flashlight beam cut a wild swath through the rain from the broken window, and a man's angry roar was swallowed by the storm. They ran, a desperate flight into the storm-lashed woods, clutching a 50-year-old journal and a pouch of diamonds, running for their lives. The cabin door slammed shut behind them, a solid thud that barely registered against the roaring storm. Abernathy took one look at Eliza, soaked to the bone, mud-streaked, with a jagged, bleeding gash on her arm, and his ancient face hardened into granite. He quickly guided her and the shivering Leo toward the crackling fire, the radiant warmth a shocking contrast to the violent cold outside. The air was a thick mix of rain, wet earth, and the sweet cherry tobacco from his ever-present pipe. This was no longer just her fight. "He sent men," Eliza choked out, her voice raw and breaking. "They're at the house. They broke in." Abernathy nodded slowly, his eyes grim. There was no time for deliberation. He moved with a surprising urgency, his stooped back straightening with cold resolve. "Say my Sarah," he rumbled, his voice low and steady above the thunder. "My granddaughter. She's a lawyer in Charleston, a real fighter. You'll go to her. Now, before the sun rises and Miller realizes his hounds have lost the scent." He pressed the rusted coffee can into her hands. It was heavy, filled with worn, folded bills, a lifetime of meager savings. "It's not much, but it'll get you there," he rasped, his gnarled fingers closing hers around the cold metal. The raw act of trust was so profound it stole her breath. This small, hidden fortune was everything to him, and he was giving it to her without a second thought. The rough paper of the cash felt like a holy relic, a stark counterpoint to the smooth, lonely $20 bill that had once defined her world. He gave her hurried instructions, the pre-dawn bus from the next town over, the exact transfer point, the name of the diner where Sarah would be waiting. His sacrifice felt heavier than the gold she had left behind. "Go now," he urged, pushing them towards the door as the storm began to subside into a steady, drumming rain. "Don't look back, and don't stop for anything." She clutched the can, its weight a solemn promise she would not break. She had to succeed. The bus ride was a disorienting smear of gray dawn light painting the endless green hills of West Virginia. Eliza's entire body ached, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion mixed with the throbbing pain from her cut arm and the frantic, high-pitched hum of adrenaline. Leo, finally safe, slept a sleep of total collapse, his head a precious, heavy weight on her lap. She clutched the bag that held the journal and the small pouch of diamonds, her knuckles stark white. Every time the bus hissed to a stop in a sleeping mountain town, a fresh jolt of terror shot through her. She scanned the few faces on the streets, her heart pounding, half expecting to see Judge Miller's cold eyes staring back at her. The bus groaned and rattled, a mechanical beast carrying her away from one nightmare and into the terrifying uncertainty of the next. The mountains that had once seemed like a prison now felt like silent, ancient guardians, their misty peaks witnesses to the truth she carried. The smell of diesel and cheap air freshener filled her lungs. The Charleston coffee shop was an assault on the senses. The powerful aroma of dark roast coffee and steamed milk, the clatter of ceramic mugs, the low hum of a dozen conversations. It was a universe away from the tomb-like silence of the homestead. Abernathy's granddaughter, Sarah, was exactly as he'd described, sharp, professional, her eyes holding the same fierce intelligence as her grandfather's. She listened, her expression carefully neutral, as Eliza laid out the story in a low, urgent whisper. But when Eliza unwrapped the journal from its protective cloth and laid it on the table, Sarah's professional mask cracked. She handled the brittle, 50-year-old book with a reverence that betrayed her personal connection to the story. As she read a few frantic passages, her neutrality dissolved, replaced first by shock, then by a cold, controlled fury. The small pouch of raw, fiery diamonds Eliza placed beside the journal was the final, glittering proof. This was real. The ghosts of her family's past had come calling. As a lawyer for a civil rights firm, Sarah understood that this was bigger than a single murder case. It was about dismantling a deep-rooted system of corruption. She knew local law enforcement was a dead end, likely still tangled in Miller's web. She made a single, decisive call, bypassing the entire county and state apparatus, to reach the FBI's Public Corruption Unit in Washington, D.C. The following days were a blur of sterile, soundproofed offices. Eliza recounted her story to grim-faced federal agents, the words that had been trapped in her chest now flowing out. Precise and damning. The journal was treated like a sacred text, its pages scanned, its ink chemically analyzed, its story cross-referenced with historical records. Abernathy's own detailed testimony, given over a secure video link from a neighboring county, was the linchpin. He provided the map. The federal machine, ponderous and slow to start, began to move with a terrifying and unstoppable momentum. A lifetime of lies was about to be unearthed. The raid was a shockwave that shattered the deceptive tranquility of Shadow Creek. A convoy of black SUVs, stark and official, descended on the valley at dawn. They didn't storm Judge Miller's opulent home or his pristine law office. Instead, they intercepted him at his father's old hunting lodge, the very heart of his inherited kingdom. Eliza watched on a small hotel room television as a news helicopter captured the scene. Miller, dressed in hunting gear, was led away in handcuffs. The mask of untouchable power was gone, replaced by a face contorted with disbelief and pure, venomous rage. He looked shockingly small and pathetic against the backdrop of the massive federal agents. At the same time, a forensic team, guided by Abernathy's hand-drawn map, began their grim work on the North Ridge. It didn't take long. The news report cut to an image of an excavator pausing and an agent kneeling by the earth. The dark secret of the lightning-scarred oak tree had finally been brought into the light. Justice was coming. The arrest was only the beginning. The FBI investigation, armed with the journal and the recovered bodies, unraveled Judge Miller's empire of fear. Decades of fraud, extortion, and obstruction of justice came to light, implicating a network of officials his father had put in place. The legend of Thompson's lost gold became the factual basis for a federal case that cleansed the county's leadership. The fortune itself, the gold bars and diamonds so carefully documented by Alistair Hemlock, was authenticated. After a complex legal process, it was ruled the rightful inheritance of Eliza, his last living descendant. The number presented to her on an official document was so vast it seemed fictional, a string of zeros that belonged in an astronomy textbook. She felt not a thrill of victory, but a solemn, crushing weight of responsibility. This wealth was not a lottery prize. It was blood money, redeemed by sacrifice. It was her grandfather's vindication and a tool to honor the dead. The weight of it was cold and heavy. Eliza did not run from Shadow Creek. She returned, not as a desperate refugee, but as a force of nature. The first act was personal. She hired the best architects and builders to resurrect the Hemlock homestead. The rotting wood was replaced. The collapsed roof was rebuilt with a gleaming metal one, and large, clear windows were installed to let in the light. The house, once a monument to decay, was reborn, its air filled with the clean, sharp scents of fresh paint and cut pine, not rot and despair. A new well was drilled deep into the mountain, providing an endless supply of cold, clean water. But her vision stretched far beyond her own fence line. With her newfound resources, she established the Organizers Memorial Foundation, buying up Miller's forfeited lands and dedicating them to a new purpose. The ground that had been used to hide a crime would now be used to cultivate a community, turning a place of death into a place of life, growth, and hope for all. 1 year later, the late afternoon sun streamed through the spotless window of a fully restored kitchen. The air wasn't stale and heavy with despair. It was filled with the warm, rich aromas of roasting chicken and freshly baked bread. In the corner, a top-of-the-line sewing machine hummed a quiet, productive song, its needle dancing over a colorful quilt. This was a stark contrast to the silent, dust-shrouded machine she had sold for a pittance. Leo, healthy and laughing, sat at a large, handcrafted wooden table, a half-eaten cookie and a tall glass of milk beside his school books. Eliza, no longer counting her last few pathetic coins on a wobbly table, watched him with a heart so full it ached. Her hands, once calloused from desperate mending, were now busy charting the progress of the agricultural cooperative she had funded, which now employed dozens of local families on the very land that had once belonged to the Thompson dynasty. The cycle of fear had been broken and replaced with a cycle of harvest. The ghosts of Shadow Creek had not been vanquished by money, but by truth. Eliza, a woman who had arrived with only $20 and a soul hollowed out by despair, had become the keeper of a dark history and the architect of a bright future. She had inherited not just a ruin, but a profound responsibility, and in fulfilling it, she discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. Her grandfather's name was cleared. The victims were finally given their justice, and a wounded community slowly began to heal. Her story is a testament to the fact that even in the deepest darkness, a single flicker of courage can ignite a revolution. And that true wealth is not what is hidden in the ground, but what is built upon it with purpose and integrity. If Eliza's incredible journey from the absolute brink of despair to a powerful redemption has moved you, then subscribe to our channel and be sure to ring the bell. You won't want to miss another story of justice, resilience, and the enduring power of the human spirit.